Okay, you should now be able to hear me. Hello and welcome to our webinar about Azure DevOps pipelines for Power Automate flows. My name is 𝗯𝗶𝗺𝗃𝗄𝗃, and today I would like to give you an overview what needs to be done to include Power Automate flows in your Azure pipelines, and of course how to avoid the most common root causes of failed deployments and things like common mistakes and stuff. We have some prepared forms for Q&A at the end of the session. So in the meantime, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A chat window. We will try to answer a few of them at the end of the session. And as we have a mixed audience today, I will try to not to focus on the technical details. So please understand that as well. But of course, your technical questions are very welcome. Oops. I'm sorry for that, there's a mistake here. Okay, anyway. Okay, let's start with a look at our agenda today. So I would like to start with a quick introduction about myself and what we are doing as a company. Then move on with our goals, so basically deployments without any user interactions, including flows, of course. And then some of the main parts of today, components overview. I will explain the different components like connections, connectors and so on, and how they interact with each other. Then I would like to show you a few common use cases like new flows, new connections and so on. And a quick overview about the real world enterprise environment. So basically what we're doing with our products. Okay, a few words about myself. As many of you already know, I'm a very technical guy, so basically I love to code. Yeah. I'm the founder and one of the creators of the KD Tooling Deployment Manager. So basically a tool which makes it possible for enterprises to make 𝗖𝗍 deployments with a few clicks. And yeah, I would like to tell you a little bit more about that in the next slides. We as Kupp Software, we are basically focused on Microsoft technology, of course, but what we are doing is we create productivity tools or productivity solutions for Microsoft business applications. That basically means we build tools for cases where limits of the available tools are reached. This is not always about functionality. Sometimes, for example, in highly restricted environments like banks or insurance companies, it's not allowed to connect directly from Azure DevOps to the production system. In such cases, you need more advanced tools, for example, to support software distribution systems and things like that. So this is basically what we are doing here. And today I would like to show you some of the details, not all of our products, but some technical backgrounds and why it's important to support the 𝗖𝗍 concept from the very first day of a project. Before we focus on the main topic of today, automated deployments for flows, I would like to give you a little bit of an explanation why automated deployment. So a little bit about general points and why it's important for those of you who are not very familiar with the concepts here. Let's take a look at the first example here, less documentation efforts. I've seen that many times that people start to write a deployment guide and invest a lot of time, explain every single detail, every single step of a deployment. Actually it can work, but it's not as efficient as it could be with the 𝗖𝗍. Yeah? So basically we try to avoid the manual steps here and just do everything within one click, even for non-technical people. Yeah? And another thing is avoid human errors. And of course, you know that when you try to transport a configuration from one system to another system, sometimes you have to modify values, change IDs and things like that. So it's much more efficient if you have some automated process. So you don't need to import a solution and click some other things and then import some data via Excel worksheets or things. So you just say, okay, one click and everything is done, including dynamic configuration things, and everything works as expected. This is the main purpose of the whole thing here. To our today's session focus automated deployments for cloud flows. So cloud flows in this case means the common flows here. And of course, the why is, okay, we would like to migrate from legacy workflows. This is not directly related with the 𝗖𝗍, but most of you already know that we can use things like scheduled triggers and so on. So there are a lot of good reasons why we should move from legacy workflows to Power Automate flows. They are just more efficient, more functionality. But a very important point here is clean 𝗖𝗍 pipelines. And with the 𝗖𝗍 pipelines, I mean, okay, it doesn't matter if you're using Azure, if you're using Jenkins or some other system. It just means, okay, you have a automated way to do your deployments without any manual user interaction. And there are a lot of good reasons why we should do that for flows as well. Because if you deploy everything in an automated way and there's some gap for the flows, then you say, okay, let's write a deployment guide again to do that. Yeah, so we just try to avoid those things. Yeah, I've seen that so many times that people say, okay, we have the 𝗖𝗂 pipeline in place. We have it for int, for UAT system, for all of our systems. But when I ask them, okay, why can't you deploy to production on a daily basis? No, that's not possible because production is more complicated. We have to disable plugins first, and then we can do the deployment, and we have to enable them again. So sometimes it's deployment for production is different than the other systems. So why? Of course, it's maybe more complicated, yeah, and you have to be more secure, yeah. But those reasons makes it more useful to have CI/CD pipelines for production as well. So it totally makes sense to include flows for production and for all other systems. Yeah. And I think the rest of the things here are pretty clear and straightforward, like, okay, right, human risk and so on. And yeah, this is one of the main parts for today, components overview. Well, there are a lot of different components here, yeah, but I've grouped them into 3 groups here. So the first thing is about actual components like connector, connection, and connection references. I think this is one of the things you need to know to implement automated deployments for flows or do some error analysis or things like that. So the first line is basically about the main components here. They sound very similar, but have a very different meaning. Yeah, I will explain the details on the next slide. And the second group here is more or less about storage. So every component is stored or managed within a defined scope. Yeah, Power Automate, CDS, and the solutions. Yeah. We have a specific slide for that as well. And the last one here is about user management, access management. It's very important to understand the flow and which users are used for what. So there's a user which is basically the owner of a flow, and then there's a user used to execute something in another system. So we take a closer look at that as well. So the first thing is Power Automate, CDS, and solution. And we do have some circle dependencies here, so I will use them as a start and then explain the other words on the next slide. So the first thing here is Power Automate storage for connections. This basically means we have different connections to another system like CDS, like Teams, and so on. Yeah? And those connections need to be maintained somewhere. And that basically means, okay, we have to save the authentication details, yeah, which user is used to connect to another system. And everything here is managed within Power Automate. And the second thing is the CDS, which is responsible to store the connection references. So basically, this is a very common entity with just a few important attributes. We will see it on the next slide. But it's important to understand that the entity is managed within the CDS, so you can retrieve it and you can update it and do things with it. And the third part here is the solution. Yeah, and the solution is basically nothing special. Yeah, most of you already know it. And now we can include flows to the solution. And by the way, it's important to use the new portal, not the legacy one, because you can't see it. Yeah. So basically, you can include the flows. Yeah. And there's a small gap because if you export the solution from one system and try to import it to another system, you will get invalid states for your connection references. So we will explain the details about that and how to fix that, and of course, how to include it into our automated pipeline here. So this one is basically the first view. We have a second, more technical view as well, but I think it's very important to understand that here. So the first part here, let me try to select my pen here. Okay, cool. So you can see it here. We have a lot of connectors, and the connector is basically the implementation of integration system to another system like Outlook, like SharePoint, and so on. And those things are predefined. Yeah, in most cases, there are a few exceptions for custom connectors, but in most cases, you can use the predefined ones, and they are static. So then the name will not change, and the technical key will also not change, so you can use every time the same thing. Yeah, and those connectors are used by a thing called connection. You can see it here. And this is very important to understand. So the connector is used by a connection, and you can have multiple connections. And the connection, as I already said, is responsible to save the authorization details. So which user is used to connect to another system. And you can see it here. In this case, we have a specific connection called CDS_SP. This is just some random name. You can define it on your own. And this connection is using the connector CDS. So it's basically a connection to the CDS service. So that's pretty simple and straightforward. And the third part here is the connection reference. And this is basically the bridge between your system and the execution context of the flows. So when you try to export a solution from a system and import it to another system, connection reference will be created or imported to your system, but some attributes are missing or some values are missing. And this is what we need to fix, yeah, in the simplest case here. But if you take a look at the pictures here, yeah, it's the same thing, but the same thing for all connectors. Yeah, it doesn't matter if you have CDS or Teams or whatever. In every case, you will get something like this. And then it's pretty simple to fix that. Yeah. So let's, before we talk about the details here, let's take a look at the technical view. So basically, it is the same thing as already shown on the previous slide. We have the technical view of connector, connections, and so on. But what is important here, yeah? You can see that the connection reference is basically the bridge between the connector and the connection. So from a technical point of view, you have the connection ID here, which is a predefined or generated value for the connection. So you need to retrieve those values from the portal and update the value with that. And one more thing, okay, the ID is just a very common unique identifier. We don't care about that. But this one is also important. In this case, we're using the shared CDS connector. And this is every time a static value. You have a specific value for different connectors, but it's always static, so you can basically reuse it. Yeah. And this is basically the only thing you need to do. Yeah, you have to update the values and do some maintenance and cleanup stuff, but this is the base case here. Okay, and before we move on and talk about the execution workflow, I would like to explain you a little bit about the different contexts here. So we have a current user, we got a connection owner, and the execution user. First things first, personal account. And as you can see it here, the personal account is not used anywhere. So basically, it's important to understand, and if you're using a personal account, for example, like 𝗶𝗺𝗃𝗃𝗃 or something, of course, the owner can be a personal account that works actually, but in most cases, it's not the best practice. Of course, there are a few exceptions like shared connections and so on, but I would like to focus on the technical use cases here. And so we can skip the personal account. It's just important that you have that in mind. Hey, don't use a personal account to import the solution, update the values. Otherwise, you will run into a few issues. Yeah. We will talk about troubleshooting in a few slides. Yeah. Okay. Well, then two accounts are left. Yeah, the TSA and the application user. Yeah. And basically, we always recommend to use application users for development purposes because it makes the whole thing easier. Yeah, I don't want to talk about licensing right now, but if you're using application users, it's easier in most cases to handle things like security and so on. But there's something we need to define. Yeah, and you can see it here on the left side. We have a connection here, and this user is basically used to connect to the system. So this is what we call execution context. Yeah. So the technical service account is used for that. But the owner is actually application user service principal. Yeah. The IDs are different here because the screenshot has been taken from another system, but the meaning is the same here. And the same user is used for something what we call service owner. This is an example, a screenshot taken from our products. And the service owner is basically used to impersonate the activation of the flows. Sounds maybe a little bit complicated. We can talk about the flow in a few slides, but basically what you can do is you can import a solution with the application user, and then you can impersonate to a specific technical service account to do the actual activation. Yeah, that makes the whole thing much easier and it works smoothly. Yeah, and again, try to avoid personal accounts, because if you're using a personal account to do the service owner thing, if you deactivate them or just move it to another business unit or things like that, the user might lose some permissions, yeah, and this will trigger a lot of side effects and so on. So it's much easier if you go for a technical service account and you don't need to worry about any personal things here. Okay. 𝗖𝗂 versus the web UI. So basically, this is what happens if you try to export a solution. So if you go to a system, you export a solution, including some flows, and then try to import it to another system. Via the web UI, you will get something like this. So you can see it here. We have a few connections here. And that basically means we have at least one flow which uses different connections. Yeah? And now we need to map those connections to specific service accounts here. Yeah? Or basically, in the more technical words, the connection references needs to be updated. Yeah? And we can do that here. Yeah? But the main problem with this approach is, yeah, it's against our 𝗖𝗂 flow. Yeah, I know there are some weird cases when people try to implement 𝗖𝗂 with MFA enabled accounts. Yeah, this is another story. Yeah, but basically we have to find a solution for that, so we don't have to do that. Yeah, and of course it works just once. Yeah, if you import that the solution with the connections and so on, but a few weeks later you have to do that again because you have new flows, you have new connectors or things like that. You have to do it again. So one solution is, of course, to try import it and let the people know, hey, okay, there's a new connection, please import it manually once, and then it works again. Yeah, but this is more or less not the clean 𝗖𝗂 approach. This is something different. So we try to find a solution for that. And actually, it's pretty easy and straightforward. So our goal is basically to export a solution, including flows, and import it to another system. Okay, this is straightforward. And then we need to update the flow. So our goal is, okay, we can use the same process as before, but we don't have to do any manual steps after the deployment. So what we need to do is, okay, we export the solution using the common SDK APIs and functionalities, import it to our test system, and then we usually have an invalid connection reference state. And that basically means you can see it here. The connection ID will be null. And this just means, okay, it's not defined yet. Yeah, there are just 3 different important values. The rest of the stuff can be ignored here. And what needs to be done is we need to update the value with a existing connection on the target system. So we have a few examples here, as you can see it here. So you need to retrieve those values from the target system and update the flows. And one more important thing is, if you change the values, you need to make sure that the flows are activated. Yeah. And this is also a very simple update. You can do both in one update request, actually, but you need to set the state code and the status code. So that should solve the problem in most cases. Yeah, there are a few exceptions, but in most cases you can do it like this. So this is basically all you need to know to implement your 𝗖𝗂 pipelines. And of course, the official title is Azure pipelines, yeah. But it doesn't matter if you run it within Azure or Jenkins or GitHub or whatever. You can do that in multiple execution environments or just write the custom scripts, yeah. It's the same process, yeah. You just need to write the extensions here and make sure that it works, yeah. This is the basic use case. Again, yeah, it's not ready for production. Yeah, there are a few other things to consider. I have a specific slide at the end of the section here, but this is the basic concept here. Okay, so let's take a look at a few use cases. The general approach, yeah, for all use cases is always, hey, identify the flows based on solution components. What does that mean? If you go to a system, and sometimes, and by the way, I assume you're using the managed approach. If you go for unmanaged, it's more complicated, yeah, but let's go for managed here. Then you have your production system or your UAT system, whatever. If you activate all flows, yeah, it will result in a mess. So always try to identify the flows based on your solution components. So if you input a solution, take a look at the system, at the solution, identify which flows are included, and then activate them or update them. Yeah. Another thing is permissions. Yeah, in most cases, we also recommend, hey, okay, use a system administrator for that. It's the easiest possible way. Yeah, if you try to avoid that, there's another way to solve the issue, but you have to maintain the permissions and so on. So yeah, it's much easier if you can use the application user with system administrator permissions. activate imported flows. Carol mentioned that. An interesting thing is platform delay. Yeah. Sometimes when you import flows, a lot of stuff is going on in the background, and as I already said, yeah, there are multiple systems involved. Yeah, so do expect a few delays between different stages of the updating process and the import process. If you wait a few seconds and check a few values, you will see it works. Yeah, but sometimes you have to take care of that. So and the first case here is import new flows, this one. And this is basically the simplest form. Yeah, you have a new flow in your development environment and you would like to export it and import a new system. You just need to update the connection references, I already mentioned before. And you need to ensure that the target connections are correctly set up or defined. Yeah, and that means, of course, you have different IDs. Yeah, this is the value from the previous slide. Updating existing flows, this is a little bit more complicated. It's very similar to the process when you import a solution and you have active flows. So usually it works here, but always consider the side effects if you have running or queued flows, because you can't be 100% sure that everything will be updated within a specific time frame. So think about the possible side effects first. And yeah, existing flows, new connectors. That happens usually when you say, okay, we have automated CI/CD pipelines, but for flows, we need to import it manually once. Yeah, that works. But if you're using the same flow and just change it or add new steps, which uses a new connector or something, then you have to do it again. And usually developers don't tell you that. They just say, yeah, everything is fine. And then we try to import it. You will see, hey, there's something wrong. Yeah. But you will not receive an error. Yeah? You will just receive an error when you try to trigger the workflow or trigger the flow. Yeah? So consider those cases as well. And delete flow, I've seen that multiple times. So if you delete the flow, it should work. It should clean up or delete the existing connection references. But in some cases, some connection references left and the whole thing is a mess. So you have to make sure that you do some cleanup activities here. Okay. Then let me tell you something about common troubleshooting here. Yeah? That's an interesting one. You can see it on the left side. We have a connection here, and the owner of the connection is a personal account. And as I already said, that works. But if you try to update it, you will get something like this. Yeah? Connection authorization failed. Yeah? That means if you're using a technical account and try to update it, the connection reference, which is related to this connection, you will get an error like this. So the solution is pretty simple. Don't create new connections with a personal account. Always log in with a technical account. And that should be the same account as used for the service owner, so for the impersonation. Yeah, it makes this whole thing easier. Of course, again, it's possible to use something like shared connections or shared ownerships, but it's much more easier if you use it like this. So, okay, next one. Okay, and the second interesting use case here is missing user details. That's interesting, yeah, because if you try to activate a flow after the import process or the update process, you can update it, but you cannot activate it. Yeah. That usually happens when you're using a application user and try to activate the flow. Yeah, that doesn't work. So you need to impersonate to a service owner, actually what we call service owner, but it has to be just a normal user account, but the recommended way, a service user account. And one more thing about the last slide. It's interesting to see that here. Let's take a look at closer look at the error message here. We have the ID. And as you expect, this is the ID of a system user in CDS. So if you go to the system and look for the user, you will find that. But in case you're using an application user, the ID is different. So keep that in mind. The process for application is a little bit more difficult here, but yeah. The connection is pretty straightforward. So if you need to identify the root cause of such an issue, you can go to the system and say, okay, let's take a look for the connection. So you go to the portal and look for a connection with the ID 97 and so on. Those IDs are always different, yeah, depending on the system. And shared data service. So this is basically what you're looking for, shared CDS for apps. And this is a static value. So you can go to the system, look for a CDS connector, and then you have to take a look at the ID, and then you will find it if it exists or not. Yeah, here's pretty similar case. Yeah, there are a few error messages and there are official documentation from Microsoft. Yeah, but sometimes the message here is misleading, and yeah, but my recommendation is just use impersonation and you can do the job. So that works probably. So what I would like to show you now is a very simple example of what we basically do and how it works in our solution. This is a local execution, but basically you can do the same thing in DevOps. So it doesn't matter if you do it locally or in DevOps, but I think that helps to understand the idea for your own implementation. So let me start it here. Okay, what we can see here is our deployment manager, and I would like to show you how to export and import a flow, including the necessary updates. And of course, currently it's building stuff, and we skipped some or cut some frames here to make the whole thing faster, but usually it just takes a few minutes. So what you can see it here is, okay, building the whole project, then export the solution, including the flow, and then impersonate to different service accounts, activate the flows, and do the necessary updates. So this is a very usual process. We have an example solution here called go.let_flows, and it's currently importing the solution. And after that, the system will check for invalid connection references states and do a lot of other things in the background. But the important part is here. You can see it here. We got two entity references or connection references here. Both are updated. That looks fine. And now we need to activate that. So basically, it's just a simple step-by-step activation process. There are a few more things in the background going on. I will explain the details on the next slide. But this is basically what needs to be done. Yeah, you just import the solution, have your predefined connection IDs, and then use those connection IDs to relate all the invalid connection references. And after a few seconds, everything is pretty done here. Okay, great. And that's it. Yeah, we can ignore the other messages here. They're not related to flows here. But again, it's important to activate the flows. And by the way, always consider there's a high risk, or not a high risk, but there are multiple causes which can make the whole process more complicated. So, for example, if you have multiple users and they need to have to use multiple connection references, it can be complicated. And if you activate the flows, you might run into issues. So always check the health after the process. There are some automated ways for that as well. And now I would like to show you a few things about our process, a real-world outlook, how it looks like in an enterprise environment, and basically what we do here. Yeah, okay. So this is basically a simplified version of our process, what we do here. We always start with the source package. Okay, sorry for that. Okay, so what we basically do is we define a source package. This is basically the export, the flows, a lot of context info states and so on. So we try to define the source package here, which can be used for multiple deployment stages. Yeah, and then we do some pre-checks. Most cases, things like, okay, check the signature if everything is fine, if there are any issues, if there has been any modification of the package or something, yeah, and verify dynamic values and things. And then we can start what we call a virtual deployment transaction. This is mainly used for failover processes and fallbacks and things like that. But it's important, okay, we have the connections here. We define our impersonation scopes. This is what we call a pre-execution, yeah. And all those things are necessary to provide a stable deployment experience. Otherwise, it works. Yeah, you can write scripts and can do the job, but in case of any failures, it's quite hard to identify the root causes of the failure. So we always recommend to do a lot of pre-checks and pre-execution things, and you need to save states to make sure you can do a rollback in case of any issues down the road. And yeah, then we have to start with the main process, import the solutions. Yeah, in most cases you have multiple solutions. Yeah, and you need to define the behavior, error behavior, and things like that. Then it comes to the components processing. That basically means, okay, post-deployment activities. Yeah, and sometimes people do things like that and using community tools to start application, connect to the system, and do those things manually. Yeah, the effort is high and the risk is high that you make some mistakes like typos and so on, or forgot some things. So this is one of the main reasons why we're doing this. Yeah. And link flows is basically what we have described in the previous slide. Update the connection references, make sure everything works, and then we need to activate the flows. So basically a simple update. And then we can do a lot of cleanup stuff and health checks and so on, verify flows. But this is basically what we do. The real world process is much more complicated, but I just want to give you a quick introduction here, what's going on behind the scenes. And yeah, in case if you have a successful completed deployment, we can notify the build provider. And in our case, the build provider is something like Azure DevOps, so we can notify the system, hey, okay, it runs, so you can close the build or do some additional stuff. Yeah, but we can also use like things like Jenkins and so on. So there are a lot of different possibilities here. Yeah, and if something goes wrong, we have to start execute the rollback, but this is a more advanced thing. So as you can see it here on this slide, the whole process is basically very simple and straightforward, but in a real world case, it's much more complicated and you have to consider a lot of things here. Okay. Well, this is pretty much from my side. I hope it was helpful for you to understand the base cases here. And we have prepared a few questions for you. So we have prepared a simple feedback form, and it would be very helpful if you can submit the feedback form. My colleague Wang will paste the link now in the chat. And now I can take a look at the questions if we some questions here. I will not be able to answer all of them, but let's take a look first. Wow, okay. Okay, we do have some questions about on-premise systems. Yeah. Yeah, highly secured ERP. Yeah, well, it depends what you mean exactly. So basically, of course, you can use some kind of application proxy if you can connect from a Azure DevOps pipeline to another system, but it really depends on your use case. But of course, you can do that, and there are some recommendations. But feel free to ask the questions again on LinkedIn, then we can talk about it in detail. Is there any out-of-the-box way to inject values from environment variables? I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but if you mean you would like to use some configuration values from other systems or from your running system and update entity values, yes, you can do that, but only if you're using let me try to explain another way. If you're using a DevOps pipeline online, there are some variables that you can use, but if you're using an agent, yeah, their behavior is a little bit different. So I'm not 100% sure what you mean exactly. I need a little bit more context here. About our product, yeah, basically it's a desktop client, but everything is integrated into source control. So what we are doing is you start the client, set up your deployment, and say, okay, I would like to run the deployment locally. Or you can say, I would like to push the whole thing to DevOps or your build server, and then there's no dependency. So the client is only necessary to configure the initial deployment, and then everyone can use it. So basically, every team member can go to DevOps and say, queue build to start the deployment. The same thing works with releases. Okay, different environments with different technical service accounts. Well, it really depends on your requirements. If you have compliance restrictions to fulfill, sometimes it's needed to have multiple user accounts, but usually it's fine if you have 2 or 3, so for your development systems and one specific user for production, but it's important to have one specific user for production to separate it. Okay, I just saw something about how to update the connection references without modifying an XML. Well, actually, there is no XML in that. Yeah, it's a plain, very simple entity. So you have to use the web API to update the values. But there are just 2 ways. Well, I had a conversation with some official representatives from Microsoft a few weeks ago regarding the topic, and they will publish out-of-the-box functionality to support flows, but it's on the roadmap, and I think there's no official date so far. Maybe I'm wrong with that, but there will be something. But currently you have just a few options. You can do it with custom scripts, so you have to write some PowerShell code or something, or you can use our services. But if you're interested, just submit a feedback form and we will try to reach out to you and okay, can we configure it in one environment and run it for other environments? Yeah, well, I've seen that multiple times that people using, for example, if you have 3 different environments, your dev system, your UAT system, and prod, but sometimes people start to have much more than that. So each developer has his own system and then they have to merge things, yeah. But if the question is related to our product, yeah, that's possible. We'll support all of those cases. Yeah. So basically our idea is we create one package and everything is included in one package. So you don't have to open it or don't have to modify it. This is the reason why we can use signatures for that. And you can deploy the same package to your UAT system and to your production, and everything is included. Also the dynamic value behavior. So for example, if you deploy the package to UAT, you will get other values than for production if you have configured that. So basically you can define the behavior of the attributes for every single value, like static, environment specific, auto resolve, and so on. So there are different options here. Which task should we use in the release pipeline to update the connections? Well, I think this is the same question. Yeah, currently there's no out-of-the-box functionality. Microsoft is working on that, but I'm not sure when they will publish it. So right now you have to use custom scripts for that. Or maybe there's some task to update the values, yeah, but you have to retrieve the values first, and I think this is the challenge here. Okay, there's many questions, so we have to categorize the questions here to understand everything here, yeah. Okay, well, I was faster in my session than I thought, so I think it's easier for me to categorize and group the question together with my colleagues, and then we'll try to answer all of them. In the meantime, feel free to submit our feedback form. That would be really great. And of course, you can post something on the LinkedIn event page. We will monitor the channel as well. Okay, then I think we are done so far. Yeah, thank you for listening and hopefully see you next time. Bye-bye.